This is Richard Wolff with another Wolff Responds. I want to talk about a trend I noticed in recent months of critics of the current collapse of our capitalist system who focus on monopoly, who want us to believe that monopoly is the problem. And it came to a head in a paper prepared for the Federal Reserve governors in Washington, D.C. The Federal Reserve maintains a research division, and they produce very scholarly, very professionally done papers on a variety of issues thought to be important in terms of government policy and the examination of our economic system. This one was co-authored by Isabel Cairo and Jai Sim. And it's about market power, which is one of the ways of describing monopoly. Here is, in a nutshell, what they argue. That over the last 30, 40 years, there has been a growing monopolization of the American economic landscape. In the many industries, one or two or three huge firms dominate the industry to the point of excluding everybody else or being so large relative to other firms that the other firms are reduced to minor footnotes in terms of what happens in the industry. And having established that monopolization has occurred, if you want the technical term for what we call a situation when it's not one company that dominates an industry but two or three, that's called oligopoly, but it's basically the same idea, since the two or three dominant firms tend to follow one another or even coordinate their activities in a legal way or maybe not so legal way. But for our purposes today, the crucial thing is they establish that monopolization or oligopolization has occurred, as indeed it has. Then they take the next step, and that's where I begin to quarrel with them, and I would like to invite you to do that too. They argue that the instability of our economic system, the inequalities that are now so extreme in our system, that these problems, together with a declining share of income going to workers, employees, versus the rising share going to capital or employers, that all of these negative, which they kind of call them, negative consequences flow from this crucial phenomena, namely monopolization. They even put the decline of organized labor as one of the consequences. Here's the problem. To do this is not to blame the capitalist system, but rather to blame one form of it, namely the monopoly form of capitalism. And I think that's a problem for two reasons. Number one, it takes the focus away from the system as a whole, capitalism, the very way of organizing enterprises so that a small group of people, the employers, control and dominate and gather into their hands the bulk of the wealth relative to the mass of the other people involved in the business, namely the employees. The employer-employee relationship, the core of what makes a system capitalistic, is now pushed to the side, and we're supposed to worry mostly about whether or not there are many capitalists in an industry, dozens and dozens of firms, or only one or two or three. We focus on how many firms in an industry, how monopolized it is, rather than on the basic system. And my second reason for not liking it is because it takes attention away from the fact that capitalism has always generated monopoly. So that if you respond to a monopoly by detrustifying it, antitrust, laws that break up big companies into little ones, all you're doing is recreating the very competitive capitalism that has always led to monopoly. So you're not solving the problem, you're kind of kicking it down the road. And I would rather go at the core of the problem, which is capitalism. Let me briefly explain. When you have a so-called competitive industry, an industry in which there are many sellers of the same thing, farming is often taken as an example. Many different farms, but they produce wheat or corn or beef or lamb, and they compete with one another as many firms competing for the customer. And in the capitalist system, that competition always has a result. Some companies win and other companies lose. We once had 30, 40, 50 automobile companies. They competed with one another to produce automobiles. Over time, some companies, you know their names, proved to be more successful than others. So you know the names General Motors or Chrysler or Ford, but you don't remember, unless you're a big enthusiast for old cars, you don't remember names like Studebaker or Packard or even older names because they're gone. What does that mean? It means that in competition, in capitalism, the winners eat the losers. Here's what I mean. The company that goes out of business because it didn't make a car good enough to compete or cheap enough to compete, that company goes out of business. It loses in the world of competition. What happens then to the workers in the company that goes out of business? To the machines in the company that goes out of business? Well, typically, those workers have to find work somewhere else, and those machines and the other equipment is sold on the secondary market. It's sold as secondhand, if you like, used equipment. Well, who buys used automaking equipment? Other automakers. Who in particular? The ones who won the competition. And where does an auto worker go who loses his or her job in a company that lost the competition? Well, the first place to go is a winner of the competition saying, look, I'm an experienced auto worker, hire me. Long story short, in competition, the winners absorb the losers. That's why when you watch competition, many small companies become few bigger companies. That's how they got bigger. They now service a bigger market, and they have absorbed the tools, the equipment, and the workers from the companies who lost in the competition. How do you say this in economics? Competition leads to oligopoly and monopoly. And if you divide up the big companies and recreate many smaller ones, you're going to see the same thing. Why? Because that's how capitalism works. So if you don't like the results of monopoly, what you're really saying, although you don't want to, is that you don't like the results of capitalism. I don't want over and over again to see the good understanding that capitalism is the problem we have to get beyond, siphoned off, deflected into fighting against one form of it, monopoly. Especially when you understand that if we even get rid of that form, we're back to square one with a competition type of capitalism that will become monopoly in 5 years or 10 years or 20. We've had to learn that lesson repeatedly. Well, then let's take that lesson to heart. Let's not respond to the absurd crises of our capitalism today by focusing on the latest form of it in monopoly. Sure, Amazon is a monopoly, or Facebook is a monopoly, or Google is a monopoly. I get that. And maybe it would be better if they weren't there, if they were broken up. But I know where those monopolists came from, and I know where the next set will come from. So my vote, deal with capitalism. That's the best way to respond to the ills both of the monopoly form and all the other forms that this system generates. This is Richard Wolff for Democracy at Work with another Wolff Responds.